still. Okay. Okay. So, I have everything that we did in my last class. We haven't done any on this paper yet, right? I should erase this whole side. And then where did we get to on the page in front of that? Did we leave off at G?
We didn't do the bottom. Yeah, we didn't do G and H.
G or we didn't do H or I? Okay, we'll start there. Okay, so I know it's been a long weekend, and I know you probably didn't think a lot about pre-cal, so we're gonna just kind of remind ourselves what we were doing, and then we'll go on from there, okay? So if you look at the one next to it, we have been identifying amplitude and period for quite a while, so those should be pretty self-explanatory. The newest thing that we learned about was something called a phase shift, which is like our horizontal shift left and right. And we do that by setting the parentheses equal to 0. So let's go ahead and identify all of our pieces. I, again, am not going to use that graph up here. I'm going to make a new one down here. So I'm just going to write over this graph. I'm going to say amplitude. I'm going to say period. I'm going to say phase shift. Okay.
I think we did do G.
We did do G, but we haven't done H yet, right?
Okay, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so G is just up next to it, so we can look back to it, but we'll do H. Who can tell me what my amplitude on letter H is going to be?
-2.
Let's not use negative. Let's go 2. What does that negative do to my graph, though? Good, it flips it. I want you to think about amplitude as a distance, and you would never say a negative distance. So we're always going to say a positive number for amplitude. What about my period? What's my period going to be?
1/3.
It's going to be 2 pi divided by 1/3. And what is 2 pi divided by 1/3 the same thing as?
2 pi over 3.
2 pi times 3. 2 pi times the reciprocal of 1/3. So that's going to be 6 pi. And then my phase shift is where we set the parentheses equal to 0. So x is going to equal pi over 7. This was a pretty easy set equal to 0. Since I end with a positive pi over 7, that means I'm going to go to the right pi over 7 units. So that means instead of starting at 0, we're going to start at pi over 7. So my first dash, a little tick mark, is going to be at pi over 7. We can do our amplitude now here. I can put 2 and -2 wherever I want to, as long as they're equidistant from the middle. And then I like to always kind of draw myself a bit of a box that I have to stay inside. So I'm starting at pi over 7. I'm going as high as 2. I'm going as low as -2. What I don't know is all of my angle marks. Now, I taught you a couple different ways, but what Alpha has liked the most and what I think you guys liked the most last class is where we take our period and we divide it by 4. So we did this earlier. We did period divided by 4 is the distance between my tick marks. So 6 pi divided by 4. Can we simplify that?
3 pi over 2.
3 pi over 2. I'm going to take each angle and I'm going to add 3 pi over 2 to get my next tick mark. Okay. Remember, we have a total of 5 important points. So I've got like 5 tick marks. We already have one at pi over 7, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm not really sure what those angles are going to be yet, but those are the marks that I need to do. If we didn't do this last class, we're going to do it now. I want you to get your calculator out now, and you can definitely add these fractions by hand. You're totally okay to do that, and I did most of them when I was preparing for these notes. But to make things a little easier and to also cause you a little less stress on any test or quiz, you can put it straight in the calculator. The only thing I want you to remember is to just ignore the pi. So on this first one, pi over 7, think about starting at 1 divided by 7, okay? We are then going to add the distance between each tick mark, 3 pi over 2 to that. Think that each one of these is 3 pi over 2. This is 3 pi over 2. This is 3 pi over. Do you get the gist? I'm not going to do all of them, but that's the gist of what we're doing here. So I'm adding 3 pi over 2 to 1/7, and that's just 3 halves. It gives me a gross number, but I can hit math and fraction in order to get an actual fraction. That's 23 pi over 14. Then, since the next tick mark is 3 pi over 2 over from there, I'm just going to say plus 3 divided by 2. Fraction again. And that's going to be 22 pi over 7. Everybody hanging with me so far? I still have 2 more tick marks. We're gonna add 3/2 2 more times. The next time it gets me 65 pi over 14. And then finally I get, oh, but I get mad.
43 pi over.
And now that we have our 5 little marks, we should be able to draw our graph. I know how high and low I can go. I know where I start. I know where I end. The only other thing I want to double check is what graph I'm doing. I'm doing a sine graph. Sine starts in the middle. So that's going to start at 0, or sorry, not 0, 0, but 0, pi over 7 comma 0. It starts on the x-axis. Now it's a flipped sign. So when I start at the middle, where am I going to go next if it's a flipped sign? Down. Very good. Down to the bottom of our little grid, back to the middle, to the top, back to the middle. Okay. We're going to move on to the next one, and I want you to try this one without me. I want everyone to have pencils in their hands. Go ahead and start this one without me. If you know nothing else, write amplitude, write period, write phase shift. The dots are what we learned, and you maybe weren't here. These are like the basic dot pattern of sine. So they both have 5 points. Sine starts in the middle, goes up, back to the middle, down, and then back to the middle. Cosine's 5 points, starts high, goes middle, goes low, and then bounces back up, middle, and then high. But since that last one was a flip of sine, instead of going middle and then up, we had to flip it. We went middle and then down.
Wait, you divide the period by 4?
Mm-hmm. All right, when you feel good, check in with mine. I have my amplitude as 2/3. I have my period as 2 pi divided by 2/3, so that makes it 3 pi. And then my period shift is left pi over 6. Amelia. Oh yeah, so if you want to put in the calculator, you could do 2 divided by 2 divided by 3. Well, maybe not. I would maybe do 2/3 in the calculator first, and then I would do 2 divided by that number, and that's what gets you the 3. Or put parentheses around 2 division and then 2/3 in parentheses. Maddie, question.
How do you know if it's left or right?
Great question. When it's plus, it is opposite of what you think, so it's to the left. Also, if I had shown my work where I set it equal to 0, when I minus it from both sides, I would get negative pi over 6. And I know that if it's negative, it has to be to the left. August.
Is it for P, is it always 2 pi on top?
Always 2 pi on top. August asks, is period always 2 pi on top? Yes.
That's what.
That was your question. Yeah, 2 pi on top always. So if you remember back here at the beginning, I said your period is 2 pi divided by B. So B is whatever number is being multiplied by your X or by your angle, and it's always 2 pi on top. Okay, I also labeled my picture with my amplitude on top 2/3 and negative 2/3. And then I knew I was going left pi over 6 instead of 0. So I have a starting point on the left and I have a high point on my graph and low points on my graph. Gus, other questions?
So cosine you start at 2/3.
Cosine, you always start at the highest point. Unless it's a negative cosine, then you start at the lowest point. But I'm not ready to do that yet because I got to get my angle marks, right? I threw some tick marks on the graph. I just don't know where they are yet, okay? So I've got to figure that out. Remember that the distance between the tick marks is period divided by 4. So it's 3 pi over 4 in this case. I'm going to take my negative 1/6. I'm going to add 3/4 to everything. Okay, so negative, and you got to start with negative 1/6. And I'm going to add 3 divided by 4. And that gives me 7 pi over 12. Then I take that number and I say plus 3 divided by 4 to that, make it a fraction. That's 4 pi over 3. Then I say add 3/4 to that, make it a fraction, and I get 25 pi over 12. And then I, one more, add 3/4 to that, make it a fraction, and I get 17 pi over 6. Is everybody okay with that angle addition, I guess? Yes, Francis. 3/4 is from the distance between ticks, and that's period divided by 4. So in this case, my new period is 3 pi divided by 4. And then now is where I draw my cosine graph. We have our essentially our barrier of how high and how low, where the middle of my graph is. And like Gus reminded me a second ago, cosine starts up high. So I'm starting at negative pi over 6, 2/3. Then at 7 pi over 12, I'm back on the x-axis. At 4 pi over 3, I'm at the bottom. At 25 pi over 12, I'm back in the middle. And 17 pi over 6, I'm back at the highest point. And then we just kind of horseshoe through there. Okay. I know it's a lot, but does it feel easier the more that we're doing? Okay. We're going to add the last step, which is now a vertical shift. That is not a hard shift. It's just, it's easy to forget about. So we're going to go to the next page. We're going to skip number 2 for right now. We'll come back to that at the end of class. And we've got 3 graphs that have all 4 changes. So when you're ready, go start on the letter A, write down all your changes, see if you can set up your graph. Again, I'm not using any of these graphs on here. I'm going to do my own. And then we'll join it all together in a second. One. The funny one.
Is this like more the layout that we see on the latest question? The test necessarily.
You could see ones that only have like amplitude and period changes. You could see them with just horizontal shifts. I'm just now showing you with all of them.
Yeah.
So just kind of like stair stepped up. Also, whether or not we have time to work on it, I have 6 more practice problems that I'm going to give you today. My other class was a little bit ahead of you, so we had more time to work on this. So even if we don't have time to work on it, I'll have answers online. I would suggest practicing this like in anticipation for the next test, or just to make sure that you're understanding this. Okay. All right, I'm going to label my graph with you. Yeah, Amelia, question? So if you have 2/3 divided by 4, that's the same thing as 2/3 times 1/4.
Yeah, but. For like the shift, why would the shift, yeah.
The shift just happens to be the same thing, like these just happen to be the same numbers. They're not always gonna be the same numbers. The shift is always setting that parentheses equal to 0, and the distance between ticks is doing your period divided by 4, and today they just happen to coincide. It's just gonna make an easier graph for all of us in a second. Maddie?
Why is the vertical shift up?
It's not up 2, it's up 1. I'm tripping because I wrote 1 and then Carson asked me and then I tried to write a better one and then I wrote a 2. I'm so
Does
sorry.
that mean you start your graph?
Good. So normally my amplitude would be 2, right? So I would start at +2 and go down to what? -2. I'm going to jump up 1 for both of those. So now what am I going to go between?
3 and negative.
3 and -1. Now, instead of the middle of my graph being at 0, the middle of my graph also moved up 1. So where's the middle of my graph at now? 1. And so I like to even draw that. And sometimes I will draw a line, like a little thin line or a light line through that middle. So I know like where the middle of my graph is going to be always. I know I have to go as high as 3. I have to go as low as -1. Now my little tick marks, I had to start left -pi/6. But as Amelia was just kind of pointing out, my distance between ticks is pi/6. If I start at -pi/6 and I add pi/6, where am I going to end up? 0. So my second tick mark is actually at 0. What will my third tick mark be at? Pi/6. Good. Now for the last 2, you may want a calculator when you add pi/6 plus pi/6, but we can also do that in our heads. It's going to be pi/6 plus pi/6 is
2 pi over.
2 pi/6 or pi/3. And if I have 2 pi/6 plus another pi/6, pi/2, 3 pi/6, which gets down to pi/2. Now, if you're like, Miss White, that seemed all cool and games when you did it, but what if I have to do it on my own? Do it on your own. 1/6 plus 1/6. Fraction. Plus another 1/6. You can still always do it on your calculator, okay? Yes.
And why is there a line through the middle?
Because that's my new center of the graph, and I wanted to draw that so I'm not tempted to put it on the x-axis. You don't have to do it, it's just me to keep myself organized.
So when you're plotting, you're gonna do it on the orange line, not the black line.
Yes, my middle of my graph now is the orange line, not the black line. And again, now I have my left and right box, I've got my up and down, I know where my middle is, and I have to graph a flipped sign, it's second or sign to the -1 times sum. I'm starting at the middle, so I'm not starting on the axis, I'm starting at 1. What's my next point going to be? Going up or going down?
No,
Down. Because I'm flipping it. Then I go back to the middle, and then I go up, and then I go back to the middle. But again, I like to have that middle line drawn when it's not on the axis, just so I make sure that my middle graph is not just on the axis, it's actually in the middle of the graph, in the middle of the amplitude. Okay? We have 2 more like this. Should we try another one? All right, start it without me. All right, I've got all my pieces up and I wanted to talk through putting my amplitude on the graph. Originally, my amplitude was 1/2, right? So my highest point was 1/2 and my lowest point was -1/2. I'm now moving my whole graph down 2 units. Do you know what my new boundary is and my new middle point is? Might be easier to do my new middle point. If my middle was at 0 and we're moving down 2, what's my new middle? -2. And then I just want 1/2 above that and 1/2 below that. What's 1/2 above -2? -1.5. What's 1/2 below -2? Good, -2.5. It can feel a lot harder if you let it, so I just try and keep it as simple as possible. All right, I know my distance between ticks is pi divided by 4. So I did 2 pi over 3 divided by 4. We did just do that a minute ago, so if you don't want to do the workout, you're like, oh, I know it's just going to be pi over 6, that's fine. But now I know I'm going to be right pi over 3, and I'm going to add pi over 6 as many times as I need to. Kate? Good, so your period is always going to be 2 pi over b. And b is the number in front of x, or theta, or whatever the variable is. And that can be inside the parentheses or outside. So whatever number would be multiplied by that becomes your b. Nikki, question?
Yeah, I'm doing it.
Okay. I'm going to now find out what all my angles are. So I'm going to do 1/3 plus 1/6. Oh, 0.5. Oh, that's an easy one. I'll just put that one in there. Pi over 2 plus another 1/6. It's 2/3 pi plus another 1/6. It's 5/6. And then 5/6 plus another 6. You might not even need a calculator. It's just going to be pi. Now I have my whole thing labeled. I've got my boundaries, and I just have to remember I'm graphing cosine. Do I start high, medium, or low for cosine? High. And then we hit medium, and then we hit low, and then we hit medium, and then we hit high. If you need to put your little tick marks on the middle of your graph so that you make sure that you hit it, feel free to do that. I just have it labeled out of the way, and since the x-axis is so far away, I put it all up there. Okay. Got one more like this. Anybody questions yet? We feel a little bit better the more we're doing? Good. Okay, go ahead and start that next one without me. Amplitude, period, phase shift, vertical shift. Okay, I've got my period amplitude, phase shift, vertical shift. I did my graph. I did my amplitude without you guys. I hope that's fine. I was at 3, -3. I moved down 1, so now I'm at 2, -4. My middle was at 0. I moved down 1, so now my middle's at -1. I put my -2 pi on my graph. And then right before I started talking, I did my distance between my ticks. This time my distance between my ticks is 4 pi divided by 4, so it's pi units. This we almost don't even need a calculator. What's my next tick going to be at? If I'm starting at -2 pi and I add pi to it, what's my next one going to be at? Good. What's my next one after that going to be at? Good. And then pi and then 2 pi. You guys doing okay with that? You see that? Now, if you panic and you put in the calculator, that's fine. We would just do -2 plus 1. And then you'd be like, oh, silly me, that was -1. And so now again, I've got my whole grid ready to go. I'm graphing a normal sine graph. So we'll start middle. And then where does the second point for sine always go if it's normal? Medium or high, medium, or low? High, good. And then remember my mediums now are at -1, not at 0. So remember to keep that straight for yourself as well.
If we get everything right and then just graph it wrong, is that like a whole point off?
There's a lot of points on here. So like, do you see all the things we did? I'm looking for all of those things when I'm allotting points. So if I'm like literally everything was right, but like 1 point was off, or maybe you went back to the
Like I just
x-axis
did
instead of
everything and then graphed it as code.
yeah, and I just would be like wrong trig function -1/2 or whatever, however many points it's worth. There's so much going on there. There's a lot of points possible. Okay. So we're going to do more like that on your homework and a review. But before we get into that, I've got one more little skill. This is pretty simple. The hardest part is finding the period. But now we're going backwards. Before I gave you the equation, we gave the graph. Now we're getting the equation. We have to, or getting the graph and we have to give the equation. Okay. And we can do sine and cosine of these because remember sine and cosine both are wavy. They just start at different points. Okay. So we'll look at this first one. Does this look like a sine graph or does it look like a cosine graph? Looks like a sine. So we're going to start with sine, okay? Now remember, this is on the other side, so you don't need to write this down, but all of our equations look something like this. And so we're going to write it. A times sine times B times parentheses x minus c plus d, okay? First thing I'm going to do is amplitude. That's the easiest one.
You said we should write that down?
You don't have to. It's on the other paper if you remember. It's on the other side of your paper if you don't need to write this down. But this is what I'm looking for. Now I'm going to see, do I have A? Do I have B? Do I have C? Do I have D? What numbers go in there? So my A is my amplitude. I think that's the easiest one to see. My highest point here is what? What's my lowest point? Good. What's my amplitude? Good. Do I have a left or right, an up or down movement?
No.
No, because I am centered at 0. So I am not moving up or down. I actually don't have a D on this one. So I'm not going to have a plus or minus attached to the end because I didn't move the whole graph up or down. Okay. I'm going to leave a blank for my period right now. We're going to come back to that in a second. That's the hardest part. It's not that hard, but it is the hardest of them because the rest of it, you just look at the graph. Then I'll write my variable. And then remember that your phase shift is just the parentheses set equal to 0. So did I move left or right and how much? We want right pi over 6, right? So it's going to be negative to show that I went to the right pi over 6. Okay. Now to get my period, we have to think about the entire length of this sine function, right? We have to think about how long it was to get there. So I started at pi over 6. I ended at 5 pi over 6. So if I subtract those two numbers, that will tell me essentially like the distance that was actually traveled, how much we actually did. So that becomes 4 pi over 6. So the sine took 4 pi over 6 to do a whole rotation. Can you simplify that down? 2 pi over 3. And remember earlier I said that your period is 2 pi over b? If this is 2 pi over 3, what's my b going to be? 3. Your cosine is the exact same except for your phase shift. So when I write cosine, I'm writing everything the same. Y equals 1/5 cosine 3x. And then if I were to look at the graph, what point would cosine like start at? If I were to say, but there is my cosine graph, what point would it start at? 1/3 pi over 3. Right here, 1/5 up there. Yeah. We're talking about the right thing. I'm talking about the x value. You were looking at the y value. So the x value where it would look like cosine would start, and it would keep going if we had more graph, would be at that pi over 3. So instead of writing x minus pi over 6, we're going to say x minus pi over 3. Okay. Can we do the same thing for the next one? Same idea there. That's it. All we did, the only difference between these two is your left and right movement. That's all the difference. When I look at this one, what does this look like? This one looks like a cosine. So we're going to start with cosine. We're going to say y equals, all right, let's do amplitude first. 6 cosine, leave space for your period again. And then x plus, because we went to the left, what's that number? Pi over 9. Very good. This period one is a little bit harder. It's not going to be as nicely simplified down, but we're going to do the exact same process, okay? We're going to take our last number, subtract it from our first number. So 15 pi over 9 minus negative pi over 9 to get my whole distance. That becomes 16 pi over 9. And as much as I want that to simplify, it actually doesn't. I know they're both perfect squares, but they don't have a common factor of 2 or 3 or 4 to take out. So that's as simple as it gets. Just like last time, we thought about 2 pi over b equals my new period, and then that time we could just look. This time we're actually going to have to solve. I'm going to say 16 pi over 9 equals 2 pi over b. I already hate it, so let's get rid of those fractions. Let's cross multiply. That gives me 18 pi equals 16 pi times b. And how do you get b all by itself?
8 pi over 6.
Good. 18 pi over 16 pi equals b. Over here, all of that cancels out. What cancels on the left side? Pi. 18 and 16 have what in common? 2. So I get 9 over 8. I know that that's ugly, but that's right. If that's what it says, 9 over 8 equals b, then what goes in front of the parentheses? 9 over 8. Very good. 9/8. Now, sine's going to be very, very similar. Use your amplitude, use your sine, use your 9/8. But instead of being at starting at negative pi over 9, where would it look like my sine actually starts? It's on the x-axis. Where on the x-axis? Pi over 3. Good. So we can say minus pi over 3. However, yeah,
Would you give us a problem that's like solve for cosine and sine?
I might say write the equation for both. Yep. I also might not at all. I don't remember if this made it to the test or not, but it's a good skill to practice. Now, sine here, though, goes low. Is that normal sine, or do I need to do something to my equation to show that I'm going low first? Is that what sine normally does?
No.
Normally goes high first. So you could start at 11 pi over 9, or we could stay here, and what could I add into my equation to show that I'm flipping?
Negative 6.
Negative 6. Very good. Yeah, good.
So it's a halfway through, right?
It's a test of half of the material. So the test will be on 4.1 to 4.5. We'll finish 4.5 tomorrow. Technically, we'd be ready to test, but I need a day of review, and that would put us at Friday, which is a special schedule. So we're going to move it to Monday. Okay. What we have now is 13 minutes of class. I'm going to pass out this extra practice that I made, and I'm going to sit and do the odds right now. I did the evens with my other class, so I'm going to sit and do the odds. If I were you, I would probably also do the odd so I could check my work with the board since the answer key will be like going up live. Another option of what you could do is your 4.4 homework, which is due tomorrow. Everybody good on what's happening? This paper is not due, it's just good practice, and I'll put an answer key online here. The evens are already done, so I'm gonna do the odds with you, and then once I have the odds done, then I'll post all of it. The backside of this, you cannot do. That's tangent, cotangent, secant, cosecant. Have we done any of those graphs yet? No. Little forward thinking, it's what we're gonna do tomorrow, but you can't do it. So don't do it. So you have plenty to do. I'm gonna keep the Zoom going so you can see the answers. You can see me work through them later. And I'm just gonna sit up here. I'll be quiet. I'll talk if you want me to. You can talk amongst yourselves. You have this to work on for practice, and you have homework
Are we gonna test review on Thursday?
on Wednesday, Thursdays when I see you. Mhm. Yes. Nikki asked on the homework, can you make your own graph? Yes, I think I've like switched back and forth every year. And this year I've decided I don't want to give you a graph. So on the test, I won't give you a graph. It'll just be how we've been doing it where we make it on our own. All right, ready or not, here I go.
We get an empty image circle on the test.
Yes. I will kind of vocalize it on this review paper. It uses theta instead of x. If that makes you freak out, just write x over all the thetas. It's the same thing. We had a little trouble with that last class. Everyone was like kind of panicky. Just write a little x over it if that makes you happier.
Would X only be allowed in the parentheses?
X can be outside the parentheses since there's nothing being added or subtracted to it. This first one is like almost easier than what we have been doing. So you're kind of like, wait a second, I feel like there's more to be done. But it's just amplitude and period on this one. I will also verbalize that what we have been doing, where we've been doing why am I recording? Stop. I need to like maybe get it off my main screen so I don't just accidentally hit it. What we've been doing before we've been doing the period divided by 4. You can still do that here. It was easier before because you just knew your 5 angles were 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi, and you could just adjust those. But to kind of keep everything straight, you can do that period divided by 4, and that's what your distance between your angles is going to be. I have that first one up on the board if you want to check in on it. I'll jump and do number 2 in a second.
Wait, we're doing odds?
Yep, I'm gonna do odds. Okay. I did evens last class, so I already have the answers up. So if you want to do evens, I can show you those answers, but I am just gonna do odds right now, so I'll have an answer key done and I can post it.
Number three is a good.
So one more time.
I was wondering if it's very close to number three, but yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah. These pi over, or these thetas over two might be a little confusing to you. And maybe on our worksheet, I like physically wrote 1/2, but just think about what's being done to the theta. And so it's 1/2 is being multiplied to the theta. That's how I know it's divided by 1/2. Good, hit math. Oh,
And I had entered it.
oh, I don't want you to put the actual pi, make it 1/3 plus 1.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, don't put pies in, because then it won't make it a fraction. Mhm. Yeah, just ignore the pies. Okay, right? Then number 3, now I haven't really talked a lot about it. Does anybody have any questions? So. So it is pi over 4, but you have to set the whole parentheses equal to 0, so that 1/2 is doing something to it as well. Mhm. We had a good question, make sure to set just the entire parentheses equal to 0. I'll leave that up for a minute and then I'll go look at number 5.
It's always the opposite of the sign, so.
When you're looking at a parentheses, the direction is opposite of what's inside. So if it's a plus, it's not to the right, it's to the left. If it's outside the parentheses, exactly what you think it is. If it's plus, it's up. If it's in minus, it's down. All right, I'm gonna move down to number 5. Are we okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll keep the graph up while I still do the beginning part of this. Because I'm going through this last graph. When I set it up, I do my amplitude first and then I do any vertical shifts. So I was at an amplitude of 4. I had to move everything up 1. So now I'm at 5 and -3. And the middle of my graph now is +1, and I do like to note where that is. And then I worry about my phase shift, so I first start at negative pi over 8. And that's when I did the working green, my period divided by 4, so each little distance between each tick is gonna be pi over 8, which actually makes this a lot easier than I thought it was gonna be. I get 0, I get pi over 8, I get 2 pi over 8, which is pi over 4. And then I get 3 pi over 8. And then I think I'm done.
How'd you get it as a negative?
So it went left.
Oh, okay.
It's a plus on the inside. And then it's a sine graph, so I'm gonna graph sine. Start at the middle, up, middle, down, middle. Okay. All right, you guys have four homework due tomorrow. We've done a lot of practice. We're gonna hit 4, 5 tomorrow, and then we've learned enough for our test, which is not till next Monday. We'll review Thursday. Any big questions for me before we're done? Okay. I'm gonna stop this.